Independent! Independent!
All of these words have been used in the past to describe the dynamic sculptural groups by artist Yinka Shonibare, which combine Victorian scenes with vibrant batik fabrics to create stunning installations. Shonibare draws on contributions from European, Asian, and African societies to create art that questions the boundaries of cultures, explores the African diaspora, and plays with the idea of African identity. His work is informed by his bicultural upbringing. Shonibare, who was born in London in 1962, spent most of his childhood and adolescent years growing up in the Nigerian city of Lagos, and then returned to London to finish his education. He started working with batik fabrics after his British art tutor asked him why he was not doing authentic African work. The vibrantly colored and intricately patterned fabric that Shonibare robes his mannequins with is meant to be associated with the culture of West Africa, where indeed the fabrics are widely popular as symbols of heritage, pride, and nationalism. Yet this association becomes complicated on a further examination of the textiles, which are originally produced in Indonesia, mass manufactured in the Netherlands and other European countries, and finally exported to West Africa to be sold. Thus, something as simple and fun as fabric becomes a poignant symbol of an array of historical, political, and cultural questions, none of which are definitely answered by Shonibare's work. The textiles are used as a way to investigate international relationships in a post-national world, claims of ethnic identity, and the stereotypes of African culture. Okwuinwezor has said of Shonibare's work that it is an attempt to propose the notion that all forms of culture and identity are constructed, shaped, and reshaped by varying forms of historical conjunctions, appropriations, contestations, and refusals. In an interview he gave to BBC, Shonibare shared his story firsthand and explained what he sees in using batik fabric in his work.
I use different medium in my work. For me, it's more about the ideas, and the medium is just a means of expression. So if I feel that it's appropriate to express something in a particular medium, then I would do that. But of course, there's a link between everything anyway. And the fabrics I use in my work, obviously that came from the fact that my background is Nigerian, and when I was at art school, my work was very political, and I was making work about perestroika in Russia. And one of my tutors said, "You are African, aren't you? Why don't you make authentic African art?" And then so I wondered what he meant by authentic African art. So I went to Brixton Market and I bought some fabrics, and I started asking them about the fabrics as well. And they said the fabrics were actually manufactured in Holland. And then I started to find out more about the fabrics, and basically with the Dutch produced Indonesian fabrics industrially for sales to the Indonesian market. And the Indonesians didn't like the factory-produced versions of batik, so they tried West Africa, and the fabrics were very successful there. And of course, when we see those fabrics, we think of Africa. We don't necessarily think of Holland or Indonesia and so I like the fact that something which is supposed to be African does carry all of these global transactions. Therefore, the question of authenticity is a bit suspect because authenticity is basically what you create. So in a sense, that's why I use those fabrics. And then I do kind of crazy Victoriana things with them. And that whole kind of Victorian idea started as a kind of a joke because in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher talked a lot about Victorian values. And I felt so kind of alienated from Victorian values. But then I thought rather than actually running away from it, why don't I just actually look at Victoriana more closely? Because the height of the colonial period is the Victorian era. So it's a kind of a play on that. But then it's quite interesting now that I've actually been made a member of the British Empire. So it's quite apt and quite appropriate for me.
In his work, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews Without Their Heads, shown here, Shonibare recreates an 18th century picture by artist Thomas Gainsborough. In the original picture, we see two members of the British landed gentry with their estate stretching out behind them. Shonibare manipulates the identity of the two figures by robing them as he does, printing typical African patterns over their obviously Victorian attire. The fabric gives numerous possible meanings to the image. It implies the African contribution to the wealth of the couple. Many of England's gentry class profited greatly from the African slave trade in the same era the picture was originally painted. Their lack of heads signifies the absence of an individual identity. This is a role reversal from European art and culture, in which we often see servile, nondescript Africans with no firm identity. Perhaps Shonibare is commenting on the extent to which African culture has spread and influenced other cultures and vice versa. All of these are potential meanings of the work. Yet Shonibare does not lay the answers out for us, but rather he leaves his work open to be explored on an individual level by its viewers. When we consider the fact that these fabrics are actually produced on 3 continents, meanings multiply even further. Is this a commentary on world trade, on the diaspora of world cultures, on European manipulation of third world countries? Shonibare leaves us to decide for ourselves. Shown here is The Scramble for Africa, one of Shonibare's most famous works. It depicts the Berlin Conference of 1884, in which various European powers partitioned Africa into colonies to share amongst themselves. Each mannequin at the table represents a colonial power present at the conference. Knowing the history of colonialism in Africa, we can read much irony into the poses of the figures, all of whom convey self-importance and a sense of superiority. Each seems to feel that he has been done an injustice by the others, yet all are blind to the injustices they are inflicting upon Africa. Here their lack of head seems not to suggest lack of identity, which is made up for by their unique poses, but rather an ironic commentary on the way these diplomats and leaders arbitrarily carved up the continent of Africa. Like the audience viewing the piece, each character has his own ideas about Africa, represented by the different fabrics. Yet just as the viewer is deceived into thinking the cloth is truly African, the characters are actually quite ignorant about the subject they are so passionately discussing. The piece also brings to mind the current state and tensions of African politics, which have evolved the way they have in part because of the way African leaders were left to unify lands that had been systematically divided by Europeans along cultural and ethnic lines. Thus, the peace, prosperity, and happiness promised by colonial rulers has often remained an ideal rather than a reality. Again, one can see Shonibare's piece in many different ways, each one as fascinating as the next. So how do we begin to describe the sculptural groups of Yinka Shonibare? At first glance, they seem playfully lighthearted and witty. Yet in understanding the historical, political, and cultural context of the art and how it came to be made, the viewer gains insight into the many complex meanings that the works create. In the end, each viewer will come away with a unique perspective on the work, and this is how Shonibare intends it to be. Thus, his works, like the idea of an African identity, become indefinable, multi-layered, and elusive, yet they remain always in communication with the past they come from and the audiences they illuminate.